Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I want to welcome you to our annual gathering for journalism funders. And today's first session is Rising to the Challenge, Funders' Collaborative Responses to COVID-19. I'm just going to offer a few quick logistical points. We're sorry we're not able to get together in person, but we have tried to present to you a great new platform for us, SwapCard, which will allow you to, in addition to seeing some great plenary discussions, to make the connections that you otherwise might have been able to make in person. And so I want to just give you a few key ideas on the SwapCard features. You can build your own agenda by clicking on the calendar icon next to the session you'd like to attend. Then if you click on My Gathering tab, all the sessions you selected can be found there. And you can also set up one-on-one video meetings with your colleagues. The hallway conversations that we would have offered you in person, you can make yourselves from the comfort of your own desk. So you go to the My Gathering tab and click My Meeting link found on the left, and then you connect with attendees by requesting meetings during their open slots. And you'll note that we've provided today and tomorrow openings, a couple of breaks in the action, so you can use some of those times or any other time outside of the program window that we have for you. So you click on the attendees or speaker tabs, click on a person you'd like to meet, and select an available time slot on their calendar. And we hope you'll use these kind of features to make the connections that we know you like to make when you're together in person. And hopefully one day soon we will be able to get together again in person. But for now, I want to turn to our Media Impact Funders Chair of the Board, David Rousseau, who is also Vice President of Kaiser Health at Kaiser Health News at the Kaiser Family Foundation, and he's going to welcome us all to today's session.
Thank you, Vince. On behalf of my colleagues on the Media Impact Funders Board, I'm really pleased to welcome you all to the 2020 virtual edition of our annual Journalism Funders Gathering. A lot has obviously changed since we last met in person in San Francisco for this meeting in the fall of 2019. The one thing that's unfortunately the same is that our skies here in the Bay Area have once again been filled with smoke from yet another tragic season of California wildfires. I hope you and yours are all faring okay during this year that's been so challenging for all of us on so many levels. Even though I find myself, like all of you, yet again stuck in a Zoom box, in my case with a fake background of our real conference room where we actually held this meeting last year, I'm really happy to be here today because this is one of my favorite gatherings of the year, in large part because it was through this annual meeting that I first met so many of you. I hope that despite this year's virtual format, that we can all forge new friendships and partnerships and rekindle old connections. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to those of you who are members of Media Impact Funders. It's through your support that MIF's wonderful staff is able to bring us programming like this and so much else throughout the year. This annual gathering is aimed at strengthening connections among us all and giving us each the time and space to discuss our current work with each other. This year's agenda is very much a reflection of the challenges our field has grappled with this year and a celebration of some of the silver lining successes we've enjoyed. It features a mix of participant-driven, open space discussions that will include takeaways from funder collaboratives in covering the COVID-19 pandemic, and exploration of the need for evidence-based communications in health journalism, conversations about media equity, including strategies for changing, shifting, and advancing the culture of newsrooms, a topic that's always top of mind for this group, but one that has added salience this year for us all. And speaking of this year, we'll of course be talking about election coverage and the war against myths and disinformation. We'll also be having a conversation about journalism support by community foundations, which will include new data showing a lot of promising activity in the field. And of course, we'll have a discussion about the future of media and what we have to do now to ensure that there is a future for the type of journalism our nation needs, particularly at the local level. So we have a lot to cover over the next few days, and I couldn't imagine a better group of people to have these conversations with than all of you. So with that, I'll turn it back over to our Master of Ceremonies, MIF's Executive Director, Vince Staley, and I look forward to our conversations today and for the opportunity to just connect with as many of you as possible throughout our two-day program. Thank you for being here. Take it away, Vince.
Thanks, David. And one of the most important things that happens in our gathering each year is we recount the ways that our members and our community have collaborated throughout the previous year and look for opportunities to collaborate in the future as well. And one of the most active people in that area of practice has been our vice chair at Media Impact Funders, Elizabeth Christofferson, who is also president and chief executive officer of the Rita Allen Foundation. And she's once again going to lead us in a discussion of collaborative efforts around this important area of work that we're experiencing in response to COVID-19. So thank you, Elizabeth, for taking us through.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you, David, for opening our discussion. It is also, I agree with you, David, it's a time that I also look forward to very much, to be with colleagues that I very much admire, learning more about their work and following their work, as well as working with them too. And I think that's really a theme for our journalism funders. Each year we focus on collaboration, you know, what we've accomplished together in different projects, what more we can do together that we cannot accomplish on our own, and also, of course, paying very great attention to the context that we share, although not equally, of course. And in this session, we'll be, of course, having several examples of collaborations, particularly influenced by the COVID-19 pandemic, and focusing on supporting journalists who are reacting to operating challenges in the pandemic and in providing coverage about this disease. Getting the network together to discuss how the field is responding to the pandemic and sharing ideas and sparking collaboration. And another related issue, as you also mentioned, David, and that's on top of all of our minds, I'm certain, is a perfect example of the kind of issue where we need to elevate the value of evidence-based information, particularly in science and health. And this will be a central element in the learning agenda of Media Impact Funders over the remainder of our fiscal year through next June. And we'll be returning in the first plenary tomorrow to questions of how to ensure quality information in the face of muscular attempts at disinformation in the election year. Truly, I think many of us can truly appreciate how our work is extremely vital. For in the context of COVID, we've seen through polls that there's a big demand in the increase for wanting to, for news, even as so many news outlets are struggling to survive with shifting economics and are in extreme distress or crises. And an opportunity for leadership from funders to enable new experiments, listening, and collaboration to better meet people's information needs and help them avoid misinformation is something that will be themes throughout this session and these meetings. And by making connections, and thank you for trying some new platforms and formats, Vince and team, we can look forward through a lens of social science research to identify key questions and promising areas to explore. For example, we know that misinformation often spreads because people are grappling with uncertainty and lack of information that addresses their concerns. And so social science points to the importance of sharing benefits of a particular action or piece of information, not just the risks. And research indicates that benefits are as more important than the risks to help people act to decide. Research and practice also points to the importance of working with communities to understand why what they're concerned about, what information they want, as so many of us are championing. And I'd also point to a new report from the Center for International Media Assistance that talks about how media can incorporate democratic deliberative practices to bring citizens into the media production and improve news reporting and trust in media as a result. So we will be asking and considering how we can continue to build science literacy information into news stories about the pandemic. How can news stories help people understand not just the facts, but why, what sources of uncertainty are, what scientists are doing to address it, and what people can do in the meantime. And we now have 3 people who have some of the clearest views about what is happening in journalism today, about the threats and the opportunities and the ways that we might adapt, their key adaptations in response to the pandemic, and the many other pressures facing the field, and what is most needed from us as a community of funders and media to help our nation move forward. I am really delighted first to introduce and invite Caitlin Yarnell, Chief Storytelling Officer and Senior Vice President at the National Geographic Society, to present the Nat Geo COVID Reporting Initiative and share a really wonderful interactive map. Caitlin, take it away.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to everyone for having me here, to Vince and David, in gathering us, though we can't be in person. And so I'm just going to launch right into something that National Geographic Society has done this year. In early March, shortly after COVID-19 was declared a pandemic, we really took a moment to think about how are we uniquely positioned to contribute to what felt like an overwhelming international tragedy. And one of the things we thought about is we're one of the largest funders to individual journalists in the world. So these are the freelancers out there. And we know this community well. And we knew that storytellers from every country were not going to report, to cover, to document, to witness this moment. And so in order to support the storytellers' desire to report on the pandemic, while many were facing the financial repercussions of canceled assignments, we quickly launched the COVID-19 Emergency Fund for journalists to safely cover the crisis in their own communities. At the same time, we made the decision that we were going to halt our normal grant making, knowing that people couldn't get out into the field in the same way, and took our institutional resources and our grant pipeline and moved it to this journalist emergency fund. In addition to covering the crisis, we wanted to support those wishing to tell the stories of local underserved and marginalized communities. So those who are being disproportionately impacted by this disease. We wanted journalists to look beyond traditional publishing methods to ensure that potentially life-saving information and resources was reaching these communities. So we launched our fund and we created a map that showed all the journalists we're funding and highlight their projects. So I'm gonna share my screen now and take you through our map. And so this is just going to play in the background as I talk to you about it. We asked journalists to really propose a project within their own community and propose a distribution plan. So this is a little different than the way we normally do grants. Those of you who know how we fund journalists in normal times, we have right of refusal going to our own media company. In this case, we said, push it out, in local communities, get that information out there. And we thought we would have a good response. I think we were nowhere near prepared for the response we would have. We got applications from, almost every country on the planet. I think one of the things that made us successful is that we had a very fast application and fast turnaround. We grant every 2 weeks. Applications were open for $5,000 to $8,000 range, so it wasn't too overwhelming. You can see these dots all over as we explore the map, just really a little snapshot of the breadth of projects. They are diverse in terms of the topics. They're also diverse in terms of the medium that they're covering. We also decided to include on the map the latest numbers coming from the Hopkins database of COVID. So I would encourage you all to, you can find the map, there's a link to it on the homepage from natgeo.org if you want to look at some of these incredible projects that we funded over time. And so, like I said, we had an incredible response. So far, we've funded 158 journalists in 56 countries. We've seen these publications go more than 200 times in, everything from some that we don't count as publications, but wheat pasting in East Africa to, the front page of the Washington Post to Rolling Stone and the New Yorker and, all the major newspapers around the world. Also, as I said, we had the infrastructure to process all these grants, to handle the applications. We received a total ask of $32 million in funding from the community. By the end of the year, we're going to close this fund and be able to fund through the end of December. We will push $1.3 million out, $5,000 at a time into individual journalists. I would also say from as Elizabeth said, a partnership collaboration perspective, because we had the infrastructure set up, we were able to take small donations and large donations to add another, more than $250,000 to our initial $1 million investment. And I want to really do a special call out to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Department of Science Education, to the Rita Allen Foundation, to Dane Nichols, and to Robin Vence, who all gave significant amounts of money to this fund. And so I'm going to be quiet now, but happy to answer questions later and engage in any conversation throughout this funders meeting. But before I go, I'm just going to leave you with just a minute or so of images taken from the fund. So these are all photographers. I'm just not featuring the writers or the audio producers, but photographers from around the world and what they've sent back to us. And with that, I'll turn back over to Elizabeth, and thank you all for showing such interest in our fund, and always happy to talk more about it. Elizabeth, you're on mute.
Hello, thank you, Caitlin. It's part of our Zoom dance, isn't it, when we're on mute and not to this? But I was just, I think, so filled with emotion watching those images and thinking about the work that's underway and lots of unmet needs too, Caitlin. I think it'd be great to come back and talk a little bit more about that after we hear from the others. But so appreciate your sharing that and the important leadership you showed responding right away to create this fund and opportunity too. And now, as so pleased, the opportunity is to continue to think ahead, and questions for Caitlin, we'll come back to her. But now I'd like to turn to David Rousseau, who, as you know, is Vice President of Media and Technology at Kaiser Family Foundation, and he's going to talk about Lost on the Frontlines project, Lost on the Frontlines project. And David, we invite you to kind of please join us on video now and share some of your work.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's great to be here today again, and look forward to the conversation after I go through this project. When we were last together at this gathering in 2019, we had a panel on collaborations among health funders, and among other things we discussed was how 2020 was going to be a really busy year for health journalism, and one filled with so many great opportunities for collaboration. But I don't think any of us had any idea that it would be quite this busy. At the time, I thought most of the opportunities would stem from next month's election, when the Affordable Care Act and its pre-existing condition protections would once again be on the ballot, and Medicare for some, many, or all would be the central and most contentious health debate. But of course, the landscape began shifting rapidly back in January, when the world first learned of a worrying novel coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. And although the horrible global pandemic that has ensued has rightly become the dominant health story of the year, and will be the focus of the collaboration I'm sharing with you today, we've still been very busy working collaboratively to improve journalism's ability to cover the wide range of health issues central to the upcoming national and local election, as well as the environmental health issues stemming from the wildfires in the West and hurricanes in the South this year. So back in February, when the pandemic first began to strain our healthcare system, we began hearing reports of frontline healthcare workers dying on the job and in the line of duty, and noting anecdotally that many were working in facilities facing shortages of protective equipment. However, there didn't exist any systematic effort to track these workplace deaths or to investigate whether some might be preventable, which would be something you would hope the government or the healthcare system itself might take on. But since no one else was undertaking this effort, a philanthropic partnership was born to step into the void. Working together with The Guardian and Guardian.org, we launched a self-funded effort to begin tracking and reporting on these deaths by collaborating with journalism schools, local news organizations, freelance journalists, and by crowdsourcing these reports through social media. KHN, which is an editorially independent program here at the Kaiser Family Foundation that I oversee, was able to provide the bulk of the initial support, with Guardian.org committing to helping us supply the rest. As one of the world's oldest nonprofit news organizations, The Guardian has been a great partner on this project, building on the great experience they had creating The Counted, an award-winning crowdsourced project that counted and tracked the number of people killed by police and other law enforcement agencies in the US during 2015 and 2016. We were also fortunate to be joined early on by a relative newcomer to the field of journalism funders and one of the newest members of Media Impact Funders, the Good Words Foundation, whose president, Aaron Schulte Collier, was a former editor and reporter, as well as a former colleague of one of our staff. From the outset, our goal was to document the life of every healthcare worker in America who dies from COVID-19 during the pandemic. We named the effort Lost on the Frontline, and it launched with just a few dozen profiles on April 15th. The profiles and investigations related to these deaths are published simultaneously on KHN and the Guardian websites and are available to news organizations everywhere to republish free of charge under a Creative Commons license. It's since grown into an interactive database that will serve as a permanent digital memorial to these frontline workers. The database, which tragically now tracks over 1,200 deaths, has allowed journalists at KHN and the Guardian to identify patterns in how the pandemic impacts healthcare workers, shedding light on the workings and failings of the US healthcare system to protect its workers. And it's also helped lots of local news organizations cover and investigate deaths in their communities and to put those deaths in context. And now I'd like to share a short video to give you a better sense of the project and its reach. So hold on 1 minute while I switch on the screen share.
Kaiser Health News and The Guardian reporting nearly 600 of the victims were U.S. healthcare workers.
An ongoing study by Kaiser Health News and The Guardian has identified at least 851 deaths among frontline healthcare workers, likely due to COVID-19.
The Guardian and Kaiser Health reporting that nearly 1,200 frontline workers between the ages of 20 and 80 have lost their lives to the virus or complications from it.
So here's a look at the database, which has been widely used by other news organizations and researchers. Among the other findings, reporting based on the deaths have identified a lot of troubling trends. At least 31% of those who died had inadequate personal protective equipment or PPE. At least 62% of those who died that we've been tracking have been identified as people of color. Nearly 4 in 10 were nurses, the largest single group, but the total also includes physicians, pharmacists, first responders, and hospital technicians, among others. The ages of those who died ranged from 20 to 80, and although nearly half were 60-year-old, 13% were under 40 and 5% were under 30. Also of note that nearly a third of those who died were born outside of the United States. The project has also documented how health workers who contracted the coronavirus and their families are now struggling to access death benefits and workers' compensation. In addition to the widespread media attention, the project's also been used by other governments and NGOs such as Amnesty International as a definitive source of information on the number of US healthcare worker deaths from COVID-19. It's also been widely cited by politicians seeking to create survivor benefits for families of the deceased, such as the recently introduced Frontline Heroes Act, which has 77 sponsors in the House and some support from the GOP. I'm proud of how quickly we were able to move, and it's been a fantastic partnership with The Guardian and Good Words. The project will continue for as long as the pandemic and our ability to provide funding lasts, but we never anticipated the scale that this effort's taken on, the number of deaths, or the likely duration of the pandemic. I look forward to the conversation about this project, and if any of you would be interested in learning more about how you might partner with us to support and further this effort, I'd love to talk about that too. So thanks so much, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Elizabeth, and I really look forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, David. And we're already hearing some wonderful comments from those on joining us today about the power of both this work that we've just been hearing about, as well as the National Geo. And I do want to turn to Karen Rundlet, Director of Journalism at the Knight Foundation, to talk a little bit about what Knight has done to bring the community together and to address COVID, because there are a number of efforts also that are, I think, relevant to this discussion in terms of showing us illuminating opportunities. And then I know that we have opportunities to have some conversation and questions afterwards. So please do continue to send those along. Thank you. Karen?
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. Knight Foundation has been committed since last year very much with a $300 million effort to support local news. That is where our strategy remains. And we really worked hard this year to make sure that many of the investments that we had put into place in 2019 served those organizations and served local communities, informed communities. We are still supporting Newsmatch, which is something that we found so many wonderful partners. Democracy Fund has been an incredible partner. The Logan Foundation has been an incredible partner. Ethics and Excellence, Facebook, there's so many others, MacArthur. I could continue and take all the time, but I won't. So this year will be, last year we supported 195 organizations. This year it's over 260 organizations that have joined Newsmatch for 2020. And that's gonna start later in the year and wrap up on December 31st. I'm also here to really talk about so many of the other great collaborative efforts that happen to support local journalism. I do have to really begin by talking about the pledge. There were 783 organizations actually that supported, it was philanthropy's commitment during COVID-19. Large foundations, including Ford and Democracy Fund, signed this, 783 organizations signed this. And it was really about being sensible and respectful and making sure that you were making your funding flexible so that organizations, so that grantees would be able to have the control they needed to act quickly, to innovate, to take risks, because this was a real-time crisis for this nation. So the pledge listed things. I'll just read one or two mentions. Make new grants as unrestricted as possible so nonprofit partners have maximum flexibility to respond to this crisis. Another was contribute to community-based emergency response funds and other efforts to address the health and economic impact on those most affected by this pandemic. So that pledge was something key that a number of organizations worked together to do. In addition to that, I'm just gonna, highlight a few other exceptional collaborative efforts. Facebook and LendFest, they worked together with the local media association to distribute at first $2 million in funding to 350 newsrooms. Later, Facebook worked to make sure $100 million either through their marketing spend or direct grants went to various newsrooms. The McCormick Foundation, Andres Torres at the McCormick Foundation, they got together 5 other foundations, including MacArthur, $425,000. They distributed 48 grants to local news organizations. A lot of organizations receiving support for the first time to do work during the pandemic and COVID-related coverage. In Chicago, the Renaissance Journalism announced it had created COVID relief grants, $185,000 to 20 nonprofit, community and ethnic and university organizations. Again, they found partners, collaboration again that you're hearing here. A number of different foundations, the San Francisco Foundation, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, the Whitman Institute, the California Wellness Foundation, Ford, a number of foundations supporting that. I do want to also call out the Detroit Journalism Engagement Fund. Knight has been supporting that for a number of years. We do that in partnership with Ford and the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan. These are, all of these are pooled funds in local communities. So we've talked about Detroit, we've talked about San Francisco, and we've also talked about Chicago. And of course, Facebook and LendFest, what they did to support news organizations across the country. And we've already heard about National Geographic's efforts, but there are some really unique programs that were announced as well. The Pulitzer Center supporting individual journalists to do newsroom collaboration. The Coronavirus News Collaboration Challenge, which was put together by the Pulitzer Center, and that supported global coverage. And I also want to mention IWMF's Journalism Relief Fund, supported by Twitter and Craig Newmark Philanthropies and the Foundation for a Just Society. They supported women identifying journalists who found themselves in really deep financial hardship. They may have lost their jobs, they may have lost work. And so that fund specifically supported those individuals. And the other one I do want to mention as well, finally, is the Google Journalism Emergency Relief Fund. That supported organizations all around the world, but it also supported small and mid-sized organizations, newsrooms that were able to serve local communities. And those are just some of the examples that we wanted to share and we want to highlight. We had a number of calls together, multiple funders sharing their ideas. Some of them found partners during those calls and were able to put these programs together quite effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm glad you talked about the number of calls. Knight showed great leadership in bringing together a Democracy Fund and a small group of funders to begin talking even about the tensions between bringing in addressing immediate and urgent and acute needs, and then also keeping an eye towards what's happening in the ecosystem and is particularly made worse during the pandemic, as well as thinking ahead for more creating more resilience, hopefully in the future. And I'd love to have all the panelists join us here so that we can ask a couple questions, because I know then Media Impact Funders has taken on this role of continuing to convene the funders together and to provide an opportunity not only today and through the programs today, but also to encourage, I think, us to understand opportunities to work together. And so I'd like to ask each of you, because clearly the needs are acute, and just to start thinking again about the unmet needs and the length of time that we're probably all in it, not only to address short-term and long-term, might you share a little bit how you're thinking about the next 6 months, the next year, the next who knows how long? Caitlin, you're nodding your head, so I'm going to ask if you might chat first.
Sure. I think, this was the realization for us. I think we were all naive as we walked into this thinking, oh, we'll, leave this phone open for a couple months and then we'll all be back in the office. We made the decision to keep it open through the end of the year. And then we're going to turn back on our regular grants. I think that was the big decision for us, was that, knowing the length of this time, that we're going to go back to some of our funding, and what we're going to continue to play with these models of, do we have in next year a bucket of money that is for emergency funding? And we don't know yet if that'll still be COVID related. It could be wildfire related. It could be political unrest related. But to have a section of money earmarked for, some sort of emergency, and then within our regular grant making, also thinking about some of our requests for proposals. We have one around environmental justice. And how does that start to intersect with COVID, a lot of the civil unrest that's happening in this country? But I think it's a fluid situation, and I think my biggest learning has been that we have to effectively and proactively plan to have a chunk of money for uncertainty.
That sounds smart. And David, you're nodding your head too. Do you want to add to that?
Sure. Thanks everyone for the amazing presentations. This is obviously a time when we don't know much about what the next year is going to look like based on the election outcome and the pandemic and the reactions of all the other issues playing through our society. So I think planning for flexibility, I was really happy with how quickly many of us moved during this pandemic's outbreak to come together and to survey the field and figure out what the needs were. And I think it's definitely looking like we're going to be on a marathon here, not a sprint for this pandemic and the implications long term of local newsrooms with ad spending drying up and the need to really think about the role that philanthropy can play in helping to rebuild the media ecosystems. I also think we'll be talking more about in other sessions the impact this pandemic has had on misinformation and disinformation, and trust in science and trust in media and news is really profound. There's lots of lessons to be learned there, and I know Media Impact Funders is going to be doing a lot of programming around that. So I look forward to those conversations, and Elizabeth's been a leader in that space.
Well, thank you, David. I mean, we're all working together on very, very complex long-term problems with some terrible crises that are also currently happening right now. And Karen, I'm going to then turn to you also, because I know in the beginning, and part of the reason that I understand that you cared so much about encouraging all of us to match and consider and think about local news is the importance, especially we can see that with communities that have news deserts, that don't have anything at all. And so the discussion even around, how to prioritize where to, clearly with way too much to do, problems already thinking about journalism in terms of some of the threats and opportunities. How have you been shifting your thinking with the COVID on top of the other crises that, local news and journalism has been facing too?
I would say a lot of people have called this time the great pause, but it is really also like a great accelerator. So the trends that we were concerned about, everything's just sped up. What we were concerned about with news deserts and what we were concerned about with local news organizations withering or dying altogether. There have been so many layoffs. We also made a grant to the Poynter Institute to document so many things going on in the industry, and they're doing work monitoring that as well as paying attention to the pandemic. I do want to say that our focus is very much on the sustainability of local news. So we are thinking more and more about how will this industry survive, and we've talked about it. We've talked about misinformation. There is an army of misinformants working to create chaos and in our society and in our country right now. And journalism is one of the antidotes to that. And we're losing bodies and we're losing organizations. And I've said this before, and we are all dependent on good, accurate information right now for our health and our election upcoming. So, and I do also very much want to call out that we are thinking about racial equity. What happened this summer was something that was bubbling before, and the outpouring around that, the nationwide outcry around that, made us all realize how it made everyone realize what an important issue it was. It's something that we've been thinking about for a long time, and we're talking about those issues all the time. My colleagues, two of my colleagues specifically on the journalism team, did work for the foundation, Lashar Bunting and Paul Chung. They were on a team where we started collating, they put into our Flux system that we're now collecting data specifically around this information. And so that now empowers us to see where we are as a foundation and what we are doing around racial equity at the Knight Foundation.
Yeah, that's important, Karen. Now, I know that sometimes, and something that want to follow up on, that I know that we'll be getting in deeper tomorrow around disinformation. Matter of fact, Sam Gill is going to be part of a conversation tomorrow at noon around disinformation elections too, coming up to this. But sometimes, whether you're thinking about systemic racism, whether we're thinking about the inequities that are going on, when we're thinking about the scale and scope, sometimes this feels overwhelming for maybe funders that are want to join and maybe are newer to the space or have smaller amounts to get involved in. And maybe let's have just a discussion about some insights or some suggestions of things that are meaningful if you don't have $300 million, Karen, to get involved and do. I love the fact, Caitlin, that you started the fund with how much money again? Do you want to just tell me? I know, but repeat the answer.
Not that much. We had a couple $100,000 and we said,
right.
We're going to build the infrastructure.
Right. And you take people joining you because you've got micro grants, and you made a wonderful comment the other day, even about discovering that even it's more work for the funder to give out some micro grants, but how meaningful it was even to journalists. Do you want to just pick up on that, and then we can hear again from David and Karen on other insights or thoughts for those who are entering this space or have modest amounts of funding to contribute at this point.
Yeah, I think that we are uniquely positioned in that we have the infrastructure to push out microfunding, right? Because you're right, Elizabeth, it is oftentimes as much money or as much work administratively to push out $1,000 as it is to push out, $500,000. We still have to collect all of the tax information and do the accounting and do the reporting. In this case, it really challenged our thinking and our structure because we knew that's what journalists needed. They needed money fast to do fast assignments, to pay their rent, to get the news out. And so we tried it and it worked well. I think my advice to people who are starting in this space who might not have done it is don't underestimate the amount of infrastructure it takes. And I would say, look who you can partner with. It's part of the reason we accepted individual donations for this fund, because we said we're going to institutionally handle the overhead. So any money you're able to give goes straight into the pockets of journalists. And in this case, $25,000 means you're funding, 5 journalists to do meaningful work. So I would say, look for what audience do you want to reach? Who are the people you want this money to go to? And if it's a small amount, look for someone who has the infrastructure already set up.
Great, thank you, Caitlin, and for thinking that. And David, also, one of the things in talking about your work, you really talk about how small the world is in some ways, because we've got partners now who we can reach out in new ways and different ways. But are there insights, even as we are part of this global community and they feel that we're a smaller, that these are big, wicked problems, but we have, needing some insights or appreciating some insights on how to join in the on several of these important areas, whether it's about bringing voice to things that otherwise have remained invisible, or thinking about equity, thinking about misinformation, thinking about some of the complex things that you think about all the time, David.
Yeah, I think this pandemic has really heightened the fractures and fissures that already existed in our media ecosystem and in our healthcare system. So it's really put both together for my world, where the pandemic's had a disparate impact on communities of color. It's had a disparate impact on ethnic media organizations that have lost a ton of ad revenue as local businesses have been shuttered and haven't spent any money on ads. So I think there's been a lot of new interest in supporting media during this period, and a lot of ability from local funders to experiment and to try to learn from others who've already given grants. And I think Caitlin makes a really good point that even the small grants require a fair amount of infrastructure and tracking and sophistication to do it. But there's a lot of us who've done it for many years, and we're here to help you and talk about lessons learned and talk about ways to operationalize it. And I do think a lot of the folks who've come into this field to support media during this pandemic are hopefully going to be there for the long term, because they recognize the impact that their support has had. They've seen the progress that individuals, freelancers, or local media organizations have made, and they know that the situation in those local newsrooms is not going to improve as the economy likely gets worse next year, especially for newsrooms, as ad spending continues not to flow into their coffers. So I think there's a lot of lessons learned around collaborations, and there's a new growing field of entrance to this that we're here in Media Impact Funders, and as funders who've been in the space, to help newcomers understand. So I think a lot of the bridges that we've built will be continued in 2021, and the need is certainly going to be there.
Fantastic. And I'll also reiterate the importance of building relationships. And I think that's what's going to happen also following this is the concurrent sessions where we've got a group for, around international journalism, community foundations, also some experienced journalism. And I think those are just the beginning of some of the opportunities. I know that even we've been enriched working, among funders that we've met through media impact funders. And I think even now to your news match, Karen, that's very accessible for many funders, more modest and larger too. But then even hearing from folks who've received even a $4,000 match, if they're on doing local journalism, that can be an extremely important signal that they can then multiply in other ways. And I'm certain you've heard that story in many ways as you're doing this. I'd like to also talk about something that in a conversation with journalists yesterday, thinking about how in one sense when COVID came, what also additional stress on journalists was that everybody, whether that was your background or not, you suddenly became a COVID reporter or needing to understand and do this. Might you talk a little bit about more about how you're supporting not only the financially, but also through training or other ways?
So I would really talk about the work that we did with the Poynter Institute, the grant that we did there. There's a newsletter and giving a lot of tips to journalists, really informing journalists about the trends and different ways to approach coverage. That would be one of the major efforts that we made this year. And I do also want to mention that there, just back a little bit to Newsmatch as well, that is an opportunity where you could match an organization $5,000. The interesting thing about Newsmatch 2019 was that right as the opportunity was really to raise $20,000 in matching funds. Newsmatch organizations were receiving those checks, and it's almost as though it came right on time. It was this magical moment for them. They got a check, basically funding, and it's general operating support. Through that was just sort of basically a godsend for them, many of those organizations, the 195 organizations. I will say that the Institute for Not-for-Profit News, a great partner there, also offers a lot of training. We support them as well on COVID reporting and coverage. And there are a number of key institutions that we support that have rolled out programs during this time, collecting data and really finding out what the needs are in local communities, but also what journalists need to get the work done. I even remember just receiving, a call like, hey, can you help us get some hand sanitizer? So there's some really basic needs that these organizations need the freedom and the flexibility to be able to pay for with small amounts of funding.
Great, Karen, and I think that also underscores the need. Even an important part is creating these relationships before a crisis happens, allows us to listen more deeply and hopefully prioritize along important values too. Also to this. David, I want to turn to you because I think we're going to have a session, as I know we're going to have a session rather, about advancing a culture of equity in the newsrooms. And this, of course, is a key topic for media impact funders, board, for management, for all of us, I think, who are here today. And how have you been thinking about that as you're creating your response to current and longer term thinking?
It's certainly been front of mind in our newsroom for a long time, given the issues that we cover, which are predominantly looking at low-income populations and supporting journalists around the country and in other newsrooms who look at the impact of policies and business decisions in the healthcare sector on low-income populations and communities of color who are disproportionately affected by those decisions. And as we've moved through the COVID pandemic, most of those disparities in health outcomes have only grown worse, as we showed in our Loss in the Frontline project, the deaths of healthcare workers who disproportionately affected those populations. So it's really just redoubled our efforts to look at equity in our newsroom and equity in our coverage of this issue, and to really try to focus on journalists of color around the country who are embedded in those communities and are able to speak with authentically and lived experience about how this pandemic has played out. Back to your earlier question, we've been a health newsroom and a health journalism supporter for a very long time. So when the pandemic first came, we worked with a lot of our existing partners, which are big newsrooms from the New York Times to lots of local nonprofit newsrooms around the country, to do trainings and webinars and sessions about how to cover this pandemic, how to cover any pandemic. And we're really lucky that KHN's editor-in-chief, Libby Rosenthal, was the China correspondent. She's a physician by training. She was in China during the first SARS outbreak and has covered a pandemic and is able to talk about early on about PPE and the importance of social distancing and all of those things. And we've also made sure that everyone we've worked with, from freelancers to other newsrooms, have been able to provide PPE. So we also got those requests for masks and for hand sanitizer and others that we've tried to work through. So I think just being flexible and sensitive to that has been really important during this pandemic.
That's great, David. And I will say we're soon running out of time, but Caitlin, I'm going to circle back, and if there's time for Karen and David also to this. We got a good comment from Mandy Van Deven, critical-minded about changing the way they're thinking about reporting requirements. And as we think about again the kinds of work that we're doing right now to try to address these critical things, how do you think about, or what kind of what have you changed in terms of reporting requirements, in terms of thinking about evaluation? Maybe a quick line or two.
Yeah, and I think part of this we've thought a lot about before, but this has really exacerbated it, is like trying to make the burden of reporting equitable to the amount of funding we're giving. So if you give someone $500,000, that it requires a lot more reporting than $5,000. And also knowing that most of the people we've funded through this COVID fund have English is not their first language. It's been primarily international, and we wanted them to do reporting in their own languages. So really what we are asking at its most basic level is, where is your work being published? Please share that with us so we can track and brag about you, really. And then please send us the media you're creating, because a lot of it is being amplified through our media partners, through National Geographic Magazine and nationalgeographic.com. But it really has been pretty simple in terms of, here's your money, tell us where you're being published, and share your assets with us.
Great and good. And I see we also have a comment about how the bar is even higher for even as we deliver emergency support and so forth too. But Karen, how are you thinking about lessening the burden, as well as what you need institutionally to be thinking about the evaluation part?
I mean, I think that, we definitely talk about, because at this point we are funding a lot of organizations that are intermediaries, and then they are funding lots of other organizations. And so, we need to collect data. So we are constantly talking about, is that a burden? How much data are we asking these newsrooms to give us back? We're constantly asking that question. And I would say, I mentioned the pledge that a number of different organizations signed about flexible funding. At the top of sort of the readout of the different things that we learned, we definitely took an approach where we tried to be as flexible as possible on everything from obviously the events and spending, and tried to just be really open and present and empathetic to what different organizations were asking us. So and we did it. It was done across the foundation. Knight Foundation also supports arts and some other efforts in communities, and so it was a process in that way where we all did it together.
Thank you, Karen. And I know that I'm going to say that Caitlin and Karen and David, that you all be accessible to those who want to ask further questions at other times. I think we're all in it trying to figure it out, and trying to create a more equitable and resilient future. David, did you want the last 30 seconds? Because I see our trusted leader, Vince, here. Last closing comment on this?
No, I would just echo your comment that we're all here to answer any questions that you have, and thank to you, to the panelists, and to you, Elizabeth, for a really great session. There's a lot of lessons learned here. I think we didn't get into it, but there's also been a lot of international, Caitlin did talk a little bit of her project's obviously global. This is a global pandemic. There's been a lot of international lessons learned, and the local and US funding sources don't always talk as much to the global communities as they could. So this is an opportunity to take lessons learned from this as well. But thank you again, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, David. I mean, we are in a borderless, wicked problem with pandemic and other crises. And thank you again, David, Karen, Caitlin, for tremendously beginning a conversation that deserves to be continued through the breakout and other things. I also want to say, before turning it back to Vince, I know that this has taken a lot of effort on your part, along with Roshni and Sabira and the rest of the team there. And so just, I think for all of us, as we're going through this, thanks for all the tremendous work. You do not have a staff of 2,000 or a team, but you do have a board and a community that I think does appreciate giving us the opportunity to bring these questions up and to share with great interest in collaborating further. So thanks, Vince.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you on behalf of the team, small but mighty. We really appreciate their work, but also the privilege of working with a great board that has also helped us to shape these discussions today. Thank you, Elizabeth, for masterfully leading this discussion today. I think it's gratifying to see that a decade of collaboration has prepared this group, this network of funders, to be ready to respond to something as grave as the coronavirus pandemic, and to respond with resources and with sensitivity to the needs of their journalistic communities that they're serving, to create such incredible projects that you've just all shared with us. I think, responsive, but also moving, the really emotionally packed projects that you've shared with us. So today, for the rest of this gathering, we are going to take a break next for about a half an hour, and then we want you to come back and participate in breakout sessions. They're listed as concurrent sessions on the Swap Card platform. You can go into, we have a new line, a new track for experienced grant makers to come together and share notes. We know you've been doing this work, many of you, for a number of years, and you want to go to that sort of 201 level of sharing, so you can go in there. Also, sort of recently, we've been growing our opportunities for people who are focused on international journalism to dive deeper, and we're going to have a great concurrent session on international journalism. And I want to give special attention to a session we have on community foundations and their work, because we have a new report on community foundations supporting journalism grant making. And so there's a program there. I know that many of you would want to participate in more than one of those, and each of these sessions, each of these concurrent sessions is going to be done again tomorrow, different discussion points, but the same track. As well, tomorrow afternoon, we'll have an additional concurrent session on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then finally, I want to just mention that today, later in the afternoon at 3:30, we hope to see you all back for a plenary session where we're going to talk about that important work of making sure that we have equity, racial equity, gender equity, all sorts of equity in the newsroom. And we've got a great lineup to discuss that as well. So we hope to see you all then. And you have a break now for half an hour and another break after the concurrent sessions. We hope that some of you use the swap card function to find each other and meet, or you might be looking for a late lunch on the East Coast or a second coffee on the West Coast. And however you choose to use that time is up to you. And now we'll close this session. Thank you all for contributing and for attending. And we'll see you in the concurrent sessions.